Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of rushing water. No weather app warned you. No siren went off. By the time you realize what's happening, the water is already at your feet and rising fast. This was a very real possibility for ancient humans living near rivers, coastlines, and low-lying valleys, with absolutely no way to predict when a flood was coming. So how did they survive something this sudden, this powerful, and this unpredictable? The answer involves careful observation, smart settlement choices, and lessons paid for in the harshest way possible. Unlike modern disasters where satellite imagery and weather radar can predict flooding days in advance, ancient humans had none of these tools. Their only instruments were their own senses, their memory of past events, and knowledge passed down from people who had witnessed disaster firsthand and barely survived to describe it. The first line of defense wasn't a warning system, it was location itself. Ancient humans quickly learned, often through devastating experience, to avoid building permanent settlements directly on low-lying floodplains. Elevated ground, hillsides, and areas slightly removed from riverbanks became the preferred locations for long-term camps, even if it meant a slightly longer walk to fetch water each day. This wasn't random caution. Communities that ignored this pattern and settled too close to unpredictable water sources often didn't survive long enough to pass on their choices to future generations. Over time, this created a kind of inherited wisdom passed down through repeated warnings and cautionary stories told around the fire. Animals played a surprisingly important role in flood survival as well. Long before modern flood warning systems existed, ancient humans noticed that animals often became restless or fled the area entirely before major floods struck. Birds would suddenly take flight in large numbers, and larger mammals would move toward higher ground well before humans could see any visible sign of danger. This wasn't animals reading a forecast. Many researchers believe animals are far more sensitive to subtle environmental changes, shifts in air pressure, distant vibrations in the ground, or barely perceptible changes in water levels far upstream. Ancient humans who paid close attention to these behavioral shifts gained crucial extra time to react, sometimes the difference between life and death. This connection between humans and animal behavior likely wasn't a single clever discovery either. It was probably learned the hard way more than once by communities who noticed too late that the animals around them had already fled and paid the price for not following that same instinct themselves. Rising water itself offered its own warning signs if you knew what to look for. A sudden change in water color, increased debris floating downstream, or a noticeably faster current were all signals that something significant was happening upstream, often hours before the flood itself arrived at a given location. Communities living along major rivers developed an intimate, generational knowledge of their specific waterways' behavior. They understood which bends in the river tended to flood first, which seasons carried the highest risk, and how quickly water levels could rise once heavy rain began falling in distant mountains they might never have personally seen. When floods did strike, immediate survival often came down to seeking higher ground as quickly as possible. Trees became more than just plants, they were literal lifelines. Climbing to safety in sturdy branches could mean the difference between survival and being swept away, and children were likely taught from a young age exactly which types of trees were strong enough to hold a person's weight during an emergency. This kind of knowledge had to be second nature, instantly accessible without a moment of hesitation, because in a genuine flash flood, there was often no time to think, only time to react correctly or not react at all. Natural elevated formations, rocky outcrops, hills, and even large boulders served as emergency shelters when floodwaters rose faster than people could outrun them. Communities often had informal, understood meeting points at higher elevations, places everyone instinctively knew to head toward if disaster struck suddenly without needing to discuss it in the moment. Floods didn't just threaten immediate survival, they also destroyed food supplies, contaminated water sources, and swept away tools and shelter materials that had taken enormous effort to create. This meant survival didn't end when the water receded. The days and weeks following a major flood were often just as dangerous as the flood flood itself, filled with disease risk from contaminated water and desperate scarcity of clean food. Ancient communities developed practical knowledge for these aftermath periods as well. They understood the importance of finding fresh, moving water sources rather than drinking from stagnant floodwater, even without understanding the specific science of waterborne bacteria and disease. They likely also developed methods to identify which stored food had been contaminated and needed to be discarded versus what remained safe to eat. This aftermath period may have actually been more deadly over time than the flood itself. A dramatic flood was over in hours or days, but disease spreading through contaminated water supplies could quietly claim lives for weeks afterward, often without anyone immediately connecting the illness back to the flood that caused it. Interestingly, some ancient societies eventually found ways to work with seasonal flooding rather than simply fleeing from it. Certain early agricultural communities near major rivers learned to time their planting seasons around predictable annual flood cycles, using the nutrient-rich silt deposited by floodwaters to dramatically improve soil fertility for the following growing season. This represents a remarkable shift in survival strategy from purely reactive fear of flooding to actively incorporating flood patterns into long-term planning. Communities that mastered this balance could actually benefit from floods that had once been purely catastrophic, turning a recurring threat into a predictable, even valuable part of their yearly cycle. Of course, this only worked for slow, predictable seasonal flooding tied to consistent weather patterns. Sudden flash floods caused by unexpected storms or events happening far upstream remained deeply dangerous throughout ancient history and likely claimed countless lives that left no trace in any historical record we have access to today. Archaeological evidence has revealed ancient settlements built with surprisingly thoughtful, flood-conscious design, elevated foundations, structures positioned strategically behind natural barriers, and clear evacuation paths toward higher ground built directly into how a community's living spaces were arranged. This wasn't accidental. It reflected generations of hard-earned understanding about how to coexist with rivers that were essential for daily life, yet potentially deadly without any warning at all. The relationship ancient humans had with water was fundamentally a balancing act. Rivers provided drinking water, fish, fertile soil, and transportation routes, making them essential to survival. Yet those same rivers could turn violently destructive with almost no warning, requiring constant vigilance and deeply ingrained caution passed down through countless generations who had learned, often at tremendous cost, exactly how much respect moving water truly deserved. It's a relationship that in many ways still exists today, just with better tools. Modern flood warnings, dams, and emergency broadcasts are simply the latest chapter in a story that began thousands of years ago with people watching the sky, watching the animals, and watching the water itself, hoping to notice the warning signs in time. If you find this kind of ancient survival knowledge fascinating, let us know in the comments which ancient survival skill surprises you the most. And if you want more deep dives into how ancient humans survived a world without modern warning systems, hit subscribe for more, because history has far more close calls and quiet survival stories than most people ever realize.